Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today, we are so excited to again be joined by our wonderful friend, Kathleen, who we met in person during Sarah's wedding. And she is I just feel so blessed to know her through connecting about Minnesota Starvation Experiment, working on fun projects together, and also her coming to Sarah's wedding in Michigan. So if anyone was curious, Kathleen is just an even more of a gem in real life. So Kathleen, we appreciate you coming here, visiting us. And we also appreciate all the time that you've put into the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. So for anyone that hasn't tuned in before, guys, this is thousands of pages of research reports. And so the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, a brief summary, they wanted to assess the physiological changes that were happening during periods of famine. And so they took subjects from their pre-control diet, which was like 3,500 calories, dropped them down to around 1,500 to 1,700 calories, which is very common, what people are eating today in these very restrictive diet camps. And then they assessed various functions. And so they went through, we've been going through chapter by chapter. So I definitely recommend checking out previous Minnesota Starvation Experiments. And they created the book as a review paper and then also presenting the results of the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. So sharing what other people noticed in previous research and then what they noticed in the MSE itself. And this type of experiment will likely never be replicated again because of how immoral it was at the end of the day. And we're grateful that it happened because we've learned so much about the systemic negative impacts of living in a state of low energy availability, LEA. And this was a relatively extreme case. However, the biggest summary of the Minnesota Starvation Experiment podcast so far is a lot of people are living in this state of low energy availability, LEA, even when they are overweight, because low energy availability doesn't always just correlate with weight loss. Within day, low energy availability is also a thing. And so we hope that these conversations are freeing to people because systemic energy production is important for all areas of the body. And so no, you aren't broken. And by improving energy production and energy availability, you can restore some functions that you've lost. So that was like a long-winded intro.
No, that was great.
And if you're following along, we are now on chapter 31. And so in today's discussion, we're going to talk about renal function, special senses, and neuromuscular functions and motor performance. And honestly, I think that people are going to relate to these chapters a lot.
Definitely.
Because these are just small things that occur day to day. And so today, and then next time, we still have a lot more left. We're going to do the capacity for work, sexual function, and then we'll enter the psychology chapter and special problems like edema. So there's still more conversations ahead as we work through the thousands of pages here. But Kathleen, thanks again. And do you want to kick us off with chapter 31, the renal function? Why should people care about renal function in the kidney?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having my family and myself. We had such a great time, and it was so nice to finally meet you both in person. And thanks so much for this continued conversation, because I think it's really important, especially what you said about how you can still be in a low energy availability state and have weight to lose. I think that is something that we just don't think that nowadays, but I think it is very true. So why is renal function important? So I think the most high level argument for why renal function is important is your kidneys and your urine specifically is pretty much like one of the, I would say, four major detox pathways or elimination pathways for the body. And so what are the four? Obviously your skin, your feces, so through your colon, and your kidneys, and then also I would say your breath out, so like through your lungs. Those would be the four. I don't really see any other real detox pathways or elimination pathways other than those four. Maybe one can make an argument for a different pathway, but those are the big ones. And so, kidney function, bladder function, all of that is crucially important for, getting the waste products from our metabolic cycle, from just day-to-day wear and tear, etc., out of our body, and so that we can continually like cycle, basically. So yeah, do you have anything to add to that?
I would say also, so important for detoxing, which, I mean, talk about how many people are dealing with, detoxing problems. And there's all these like detox protocols, detox supplements.
Right.
Well, what if it's a combination of increased toxin exposure in the environment? No doubt that's a problem.
100%.
But what if being in a low energy availability is hindering the body's natural ability to detoxify these properly? And I think that the Minnesota Starvation Experiment kind of demonstrates this pretty clearly. And none of us are saying that toxin loads are a problem, but they're going to be even a bigger problem if your kidney isn't functioning properly, if your detox pathways aren't functioning properly. I just made a few other notes of like why you should care about kidney health. It's also super important for regulating water balance and electrolyte status in the body. And I don't think people realize that the kidney plays a major role.
Right.
And we'll see some of that during the discussion today. And also that helps, control fluid volume for proper blood pressure, which talk about the amount of people on blood pressure medications these days. So I think kidney function is pretty important. And I think a lot of people overlook it. A lot of people focus more on liver health, which I think is important, but your kidney needs some loving too. And kidneys, just like every other organ system in the body, it needs proper energy to function. And if we're going to be seeing the kidney shrink in size, which we talked about in previous chapters, when you're in a low energy availability state, some of your organs literally shrink.
Right.
It's not going to function properly. You can't expect it to if it's smaller.
Yeah, so. I think we're going to bring up some important points and a lot of symptoms and diagnoses that people experience or receive nowadays that are very much related to the low energy availability state versus things like oxalate and other things that people blame, quote unquote, blame for kidney issues. So, I think like kicking it off, the first thing that stood out to me is excessive urination, especially at night.
Yes. And that water balance. So, how many people can relate to waking up, having to pee all the time in the middle of the night and peeing a lot, right? Like, of course we're supposed to pee. Like, you shouldn't not be peeing, but are we supposed to be peeing a lot throughout the night and a lot throughout the day? That was one of the biggest things that they saw in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, is just a pure increase in fluid volume loss through pee.
Right. And, the issue with fluid volume loss is, again, is it, mostly just urea, which comes from the urea cycle. This is why it's called urine, right? Because of urea in the urine. That's what kind of gives it this like distinctive, nitrogen type smell. Is it electrolytes? Is it phosphates? Is it oxalates? Is it primarily just water? And so I think the concentration, the pH of your urine, all of these factors are really important. And you see these change, the uric acid content in the urine, like you see all of these change, not only in their reports of what happened in the field and in other experiments, but also in the MSE itself.
I have noted that the polyuria, which is the increase of fluid loss, developed very early on in the MSE subjects, and they would lose 1.3 gallons of water in their urine. That's a lot of pee to lose per day.
Wow. Were they commonly compensating and drinking that much?
Yes. Yes.
That was actually my first note for this chapter.
Were they naturally more thirsty, or were they forcing it?
They were naturally more thirsty, and they were also craving more salt, which we've talked about the salt kind of issue in the past on other episodes. But they, in many ways, I think that they were trying to fill the void, so to speak, of their stomach. But also when you're, we kind of talked about this loosely, but when you enter a low energy availability state, in many ways, sodium replaces potassium in the cell. And so it basically to maintain this idea of like a membrane potential and basically voltage for the cell to still function and stuff. And so in order to provide that, you have the sodium. Also, in a low energy availability state, you obviously have changes to aldosterone. If you're not signaling insulin, then you have changes to the kidney, maintaining that electrolyte balance and keeping those electrolytes versus just wasting the electrolytes. So I think there's a lot of just wasting that's going on. And so that's why you see this like big increase in sodium intake. But also the changes to things like aldosterone, etc. I think play a big role as well.
So if somebody was in this state and they're naturally craving more of like salty things, that is a signal to the body that they need more sodium. Would you say that at the same time they do need increased amounts of potassium, or is it just a sodium?
So out of an abundance of caution, I would be very careful with taking potassium in this stage. If you are in this state where you're like craving salt on everything, and I was there, and like I know that I'm starting to regress. Like I just had a couple poor nights of sleep because Henry is teething. Like I start to crave more and more salt when that happens, and so I know my energetic level, my robustness, like whatever you want to call it, is starting to regress when that happens. And it's again because sodium is now starting to pick up the burden, so to speak, for the potassium. And with the thing with potassium and also with magnesium is you have to be able to get them into the cell because they're the primary intracellular electrolytes, right? Where sodium and calcium are the primary extracellular, and they do flop, back and forth and stuff, but primarily we have them excluded. And if you can't get, because the energetics of the cell, if you cannot get potassium and magnesium into the cell, then that's where sodium and calcium come in. And so just taking a bunch of potassium, you would think, well, concentration gradients, etc., but that's not necessarily how the body works, right? Just because there's a concentration gradient of potassium outside of the cell doesn't mean it's actually going to get into the cell. This has to do, whether you take the conventional view of like the ATP pump, of the sodium potassium pump, or you take more of like a Gilbert-Ling idea of like the exclusion, and based off of how the cell water is structured, that excludes sodium and calcium and then, brings in potassium and magnesium. They're basically saying the same thing, just like a slight different mechanism as to how it's working, right? So if you cannot get that potassium or that magnesium in, then that becomes a potentially dangerous situation. And so you hear people have potentially heart issues with taking too much potassium and magnesium too, because the electrolytes change the local electromagnetic field around the heart, and then that can change, the heart rhythm, etc. So that's where the issue comes in. So I would not, again, like, work with your doctor, because there's some cases where, yes, even in this state, you need to take potassium. But I would be very cautious if you're in this state with taking potassium. And if anything, I would get it from food. Like, don't take it as a supplement, get it from food.
I was going to say, guess what the best source of potassium is? Carbohydrates.
Exactly.
Carbohydrates.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because I think that we're seeing this sodium potassium imbalance experiment at a large scale in real time right now in the keto space.
Yes.
So you have these electrolyte packets like LMNT providing super physiological levels of salt.
Right.
Granted, if someone is an athlete and sweating a ton each day, yeah, they're losing salt.
Right.
But now you have these LMNT packets that are providing the body with huge levels of salt, and then they're not getting sufficient potassium from carbohydrates. So that itself could cause an imbalance. And so I think it's important to tune into your salt cravings.
Right.
But
well, is that intentional because I know LMNT is marketed more towards the low carb space. So are they intentionally trying to replace and utilize salt for this purpose?
I don't think that they necessarily know this is why this is happening. And like, I obviously, I think people like Dr. Paul Saladino has talked about like when he was carnivore and he started to have electrolyte issues and needing to add back in carbohydrates and stuff because of this, insulin response and other responses, right? Like aldosterone, et cetera.
Wait, insulin is good?
Yeah, yes, it is. Very much so. Yeah, because of this response in the kidney, right? And like maintaining the electrolyte status of the body and not just wasting the electrolytes. So I don't necessarily think that most understand that that's what's going on. But they are like, well, I'm craving salt. I need more salt. I'm adding salt to everything. This tastes really good to me. And so, the LMNT products, et cetera. I don't want to just call out them because there's so many products on the market that are like
basically just sodium.
Yeah.
It's expensive flavored sodium.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so this is an important quote that I wrote down from the MSE, and I think it kind of explains why people feel better using electrolyte packets. So, quote, "It must be noted that the kidneys have a somewhat altered task to perform in the semi-starved person as compared with that in the well-fed person. Starving man tends to consume far more water and, if available, a lot more salt, and those pose problems for the kidney.
Right. Yeah, because if you think about it, so this is again why I'm a huge fan of things like drop dosing and taking more like physiologic amounts of something more frequently versus kind of a super physiologic dose. Because if you don't use, so like you might be craving all this salt, but maybe it's really only a threshold of like, I don't know, 100 milligrams or something like that. But you just took an entire LMNT product or like whatever product, right? And you just, I don't know, got 1,000 milligrams. And like, to a point, the stomach you will start to get nauseous if you have too much salt, like that. A lot of people will throw up if they have too much salt. But to another point, like when you're in this state, those signals and stuff are not necessarily being communicated, right? And so you may not get that like, oh, I don't feel good, I don't want any more salt signal. And then you absorb all of this salt, and then it's like, oh, but the cells can't use all of this salt right now. Or again, the aldosterone, et cetera, status, hormonal status of the body. Like, we don't want all this salt right now. So then it sends it to the kidney, and the kidney's like, well, I guess I got to get rid of this. But then that puts more burden on the kidney, et cetera. So, because the kidney is basically constantly sampling the blood, right? That's basically what it is the waste product from the blood. So yeah, I could see how and then that's just putting more of an energetic demand on the kidney. The kidney doesn't have the energy. And then so we see how this leads to like this negative feedback cycle, or well, really it's a positive feedback cycle, but in a negative manner of we just push the snowball down, or the, what is Sisyphus basically, where he's like trying to push up the big boulder and it keeps rolling back on him. Yeah, that's basically what's happening. So, and they noted how they don't believe it's renal disease. So it's specific to the LEA state versus someone having like kidney failure, et cetera. So I experienced, so when I was in the LEA, I had major kidney issues. My GFR dropped to 30. GFR is the glomerular filtration rate. So it's basically how well is the kidney filtering. But that wasn't because of the LEA. That was because of the like side effects of the LEA, that I was having repeated rhabdo. And so all of those proteins that were rapidly being excreted through my kidney, that's what damaged my kidneys. And you can overcome this. Like, a lot of doctors don't seem to think that you can overcome a low GFR, that eventually you just have to, basically, once your GFR is that low, a lot of doctors believe that it's impossible to raise it again. But that has not been my experience. I know there's been so many anecdotes of people being able to raise their GFR again. Mine took about, a solid 3 years to get back over 90, but it is very possible. And I didn't do anything special. Like, people always ask me, what did I do? And I did kind of exactly what we've talked about, some very low dose targeted supplementation, but not anything crazy. Like, we're talking like B vitamins and organs. And then addressing my low energy availability state with enough food, and then also, obviously the lifestyle things of like sleep and sunlight and, good relationships and all that stuff. Those things are very important as well. But it's not like I took any medication or anything to get it back up there.
So to summarize this part so far, polyuria, so excessive peeing, and nocturia. I'm not saying those right at all, but that's how I pronounce them in my head.
I understand. It's like methionine versus methionine.
Polyuria, excessive peeing, and nocturia, waking up in the night to urinate. So both have been reported by practically every observer of starvation conditions. That's what the MSE chapter talked about. And there's problems with electrolyte imbalances. There's also like the body is literally starving for food. And so I thought that this was an interesting part of the chapter. Quote, however, one should always keep in mind that the semi-starved subject delights in, quote, souping his food with water and in just drinking water in an attempt to satisfy the desire for the sensation of a full stomach. Souping of food was marked in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment and has been reported in a number of prisoners of war. So basically just overconsumption of water to try to satisfy this desire for energy,
right?
This craving for food, when at those times the food wasn't available, but in modern times, potentially sometimes self-induced through the desire to eat lower and lower calorie,
right,
in the pursuit of ever being smaller and smaller. And it's like obviously not an easy mental state given diet culture today, but it is a similar experience. And this large increase in urine is causing electrolyte imbalances and then also putting an extra burden on the kidney, as you mentioned.
Well, I almost wonder too about like the kind of overconsumption of things like soda and stuff. And so we're talking about like nutrient density in a way, like our bodies are constantly sampling, what are we taking in? Are we getting enough, macros and then also micros, right? And so I almost wonder if kind of like the overconsumption of sodas and beverages like sodas has a lot to do with that. Kind of again talking more about the other side of the pendulum. So we're talking more about like the overweight group, and yeah. So I think again this is why nutrient density and like hitting 100% of those theoretical RDAs and stuff is very important because of this reason.
Yep.
I mean, there's also the like 0-calorie, sugar-free Zevia, that kind of stuff too, that could be the same craving. It's just not causing weight gain, obviously, but in a different population.
Exactly. Yeah. And something else, they saw a lot of incontinence, and so many people experience incontinence nowadays. And yes, like, a lot of it, I think, is attributed for example, with women who have had children, of course, like that's a huge change to the pelvic floor. It takes time for the pelvic floor to come back. Like a lot of women have major, things that happen during delivery to their pelvic floor, like major, grade 3, grade 4 tears, all of that stuff. But I also wonder too, a lot of how much of that is more the structural side. And they do believe that they see changes to the pelvic floor. We already talked about like the pressure dynamics and the possible structural changes to things like the pelvic floor, the positioning of the stomach, like all that stuff. But yeah, I wonder how much more of it is like due to, the kind of potential trauma of things like childbirth versus, yes, that's there, but women, we've been delivering children since the dawn of man. And, like how many more pelvic floor issues do we have nowadays, potentially because of things like the LEA? And it's not only about the pelvic floor, like there's also the, autonomic nervous system function. And like, are we getting correct signals to the nerves to, open certain valves, etc. I think that's a big...
Keep the valve closed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a big question too.
So they not only noticed an increase in urination, but they also noticed a change in the pee.
Right.
So they said that the urine in this LEA state is classically a pale fluid containing little or no pigment and very little sediment. So a question that I had for you, Kathleen, where do you think that sediment is staying? Do you think it's just not being filtered out? So typically your pee should be yellow, but if you're excessively peeing and it's very pale with very little sediment, that means it's largely just water.
Right. Yeah, they also saw low calcium content, which again goes back to what we were talking about with sodium and calcium in the cell. So with the sediment, I think there's partially the side of they're just not consuming a lot, and so there's just not a lot of sediment to get rid of. I also think that there's partially the side of the body's probably just storing it because...
kidney stones?
Yeah, well, and that's what they say. They say members were much puzzled by a large increase in renal calculi. A number of stones removed at operation were examined chemically and found to consist almost exclusively of oxalate. Let's see here. Evidence to show that on a water-restricted regimen, edema fluid may be mobilized and excreted by the kidney, thus preventing the formation of a highly concentrated urine. So there's the edema issue, there's the oxalate issue, there's I think at a point the body is kind of in self-preservation mode, and it's like, my kidney cells have already been damaged so much that I'm not going to let them get damaged anymore. And we obviously see the reduction in size of the kidney. And so I think, I don't know necessarily where these things are being stored, but I definitely could imagine that the kidney or that the body stores. I mean, I have my own anecdote about this. When I went through, kind of my refeeding phase, my reverse, and specifically once I started adding milk, because I had never really had milk my entire life. More so because I have a whey issue versus I don't have a lactose issue. I just don't do well with whey. But I just like forced myself to have milk because I was like, I know I need calcium because I know I've not had sufficient calcium basically my entire life. When I first started doing that though, I noticed a ton of sediment in my urine, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's oxalate. That's oxalate." I was like, "No, this can't be oxalate," because I was one that I naturally kind of ate a lower oxalate diet anyways, which I think a lot of people do, if they don't fall into some of these health trends of like, let me spam the spinach,
Spinach and
smoothies.
almonds in my smoothies.
Yeah. Not spinach is okay, but again, properly prepared, all that stuff. Not too much too. But so I had it tested, and it was phosphates that were coming out, which is very interesting based off of like what Ray talks about with, Dr. Ray P talked about with like the calcium to phosphate ratio and stuff. But yeah, I dumped, quantitatively, I don't know, but it to me, it looked like a lot of phosphate was coming out of me. A lot of the sediment was coming out of me. And so I could just imagine like, where was that being stored inside my body? I don't know, but I definitely could see in this LEA state, people storing things like phosphates, etc.
So what if this large oxalate sensitivity that we're seeing, again, this wasn't really a problem in previous generations because we saw, there's entire tribes that consume sweet potatoes for their bulk of their food. What if in an LEA state, your kidney is so burdened from the electrolyte imbalance, the water fluid imbalances that it has to deal with, that it's easier for the kidney to just stuff these things to the side and store it because it doesn't have the energy capacity to properly detoxify it and put it in the urine for you to get rid of it? Wouldn't that be a freeing thing to think about?
Exactly. And there is we know a pH dependence upon certain like excretions of sediments, things like oxalate, etc. So like you're more likely to excrete oxalate depending upon the pH of the urine. I forgot if it's more acidic versus more basic. I don't remember, but so I don't remember seeing anything in here if they measured like pH, but that would have been interesting to see too. Like, did they see a change in pH, and then did that kind of correlate with a change in sediment, and then like how much oxalate they saw in the urine, etc. But yeah, I think it is incredibly freeing again to kind of look at like, maybe again, it's not the oxalates that is the problem. Like maybe it's the fact that you're just in this LEA state, and that's the problem. Like if anything too, a lot of the research shows that endogenous oxalate, like yes, too much oxalate coming in from spamming spinach smoothies, I would not necessarily recommend, right? But endogenous oxalate production seems to be more the potential issue. I'm happy to be wrong with that. But again, based off of what we've eaten in the past, based off of what the research I have seen has shown, that seems to be more the problem. And so again, like you said, that's very freeing. If we can just address the LEA, and then we can, handle more oxalate containing foods. And again, if we cook them the way that you're supposed to cook the foods, like most of that oxalate is taken care of anyways. And then also you address your own metabolic issues of why you're overproducing oxalate for whatever reason, because we do produce endogenous oxalate, which I don't think people realize that either.
So the next part kind of talks about renal function tests that are performed in animal experiments. And again, these type of things are not the easiest to do on humans. And so I think it's of value to pay attention to the animal studies. And I thought that this was interesting. Rats on a low calorie diet for just 30 to 40 days had both edema. I don't know how to pronounce this word. I just make a fool of myself. Edema and ascites.
Yeah.
Okay, edema and ascites. So
yeah, that's the stomach fluid, which again, like we talk about, so many people are like, oh, I have all of this like stomach fat and stuff. And it's like, okay, yeah, probably some of it is a little bit of fat, especially as you're starting to refeed, or like depending upon where you are, because the body is like trying to protect those internal organs, again, the pressure dynamics, all of that stuff. But also a lot of that can be water, and it's very difficult to tell the difference unless you have some type of like imaging done, basically.
I wrote down a definition.
You can feel it sometimes if you go on like a rebounder and you just
I wrote down a definition because I honestly didn't know that this was a medical term. Yeah. So ascites, I said it right?
Yes, ascites. Yeah.
Ascites. I got to inbrain that in my head. Is the medical term for the abdominal accumulation of fluid in the cavity, the space where the abdomen that houses the abdominal organs. This buildup can cause the abdomen to become swollen and distended. And of course, most people have fat in their stomach area, but like they saw a large increase in both edema, so fluid retention, and ascites in rats on these low calorie diets. And they also saw these in a number of human observations as well.
Yeah, and this was also,
no, sorry. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, so many people are like experience bloating
right
these days. And I wonder if some of it is correlated to this and not necessarily, because a lot of people will say like, I just take a sip of water and I get instantly bloated.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's this.
Yeah, that's I think a very interesting and very possible thing that's going on. And we know that this happens, right? Like you all the time, like you'll see people that are like, oh yeah, I had to get, drainage tubes put in, especially like people that have cancer and stuff like that. They'll get drainage tubes put in their abdomen because they're getting ascites and stuff. But yeah, and like what you said with bloating, it's like, it really, if you drink water, like it doesn't make really much sense that would then cause some type of like microbiome response, especially like right away, that's causing like gas, etc., to then cause like a distended stomach and everything. Like if anything, it's like, okay, I wonder what happened where you drink some water and then like, what communication is going on that the body's like, okay, just dump more water into the cavity. Yeah, I don't know, but I think
unless you're chugging like a whole lot of water at once, then that's a volume issue.
Right. Yeah. And for me too, about the bloating thing, I think I said this during one of the discussions we had, but like I eat a lot at one meal and I'm a small person, right? Like
big girlies, big meal girlies, big meal girlies.
Yeah. And so like my left side, it's funny because when I was pregnant with Harrison, he was in my left lobe because I have a bicornuate uterus. And so after I eat, many times it reminds me of like when he was in my left lobe of my bicornuate uterus, because my stomach gets, fairly big and stuff. But then over time, as it's starting to empty, as I'm starting to digest and stuff, all of that goes down. And I think that is very normal. But I think for a lot of people, someone would be like, oh my goodness, I'm bloated. And it's like, no, this is not the same thing as like true bloating. It's just like, no, you're just eating a fair amount of food for what you need. And that's okay.
Yeah. So they also noted that like there's actual documentation of kidney malfunction. And so they say, quote, the kidney of the semi-starved rat employs a different method for producing diuresis than is used under normal conditions. So they administered 5% of the animal's weight in water by the stomach tube, and this produced a diuresis during a 3-hour observation period that was only about half that which occurred during the control period. So this observation was thought to confirm the widespread opinion that the semi-starved animal has a tendency to water retention. Dilution tests demonstrate a small but significant loss of the ability to produce dilute urine, while concentration tests showed a large loss of the ability to produce a concentrated urine. So I think that there's like multi-levels. The body is in such a imbalanced, I feel like electrolyte loss and fluid water balance, like those come hand in hand. So if you have an electrolyte imbalance, you're going to have water retention issues, but then there's also an inability of the kidney to properly get rid of the water. So the term glomerular, so it's a structure in the kidneys that filters the blood to form urine. So they actually saw that this just isn't functioning properly.
Right.
And they tested this in various animal studies and showed that in the semi-starved state, the glomerular filtration rate increased as the rate of urine became larger. So again, it just seems like the kidney is just holding up a red flag. Like, guys, I need help. I am just doing the best that I can right now. And one question that I wrote down for you, Kathleen, it seems like there's some conflicting things going on. In a semi-starved state, you increase your water intake because your body is like craving energy. And so you're almost trying to fill that void. We're seeing increased levels of urine, specifically paler urine, and that sediment is being stored elsewhere, not being filtered out. But then we also see edema. So we see fluid retention.
Right.
Why is there both increased fluid loss and edema?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting thing because it's like, where's the water coming from? Like, right? Like it would be interesting if they had measured, how much water they took in versus how much water they urinated out, right? Because Ray would talk about how, Dr. Ray Pete would talk about how this could be like a proxy measurement to how good your metabolism was, that you would basically drink X amount of fluid, and obviously like temperature would matter and all this stuff, but based off of then how much you urinated out, that would then say like if you had a higher metabolic rate because you were either breathing it out or you were you were just like sweating it out, or basically it was just coming out as sweat. And And so you basically, the higher the metabolic rate, the less fluid you would almost expect to urinate out because it's coming out in other ways. But so about the edema issue, we obviously make water at the end of the electron transport chain. And so again, I have still yet to find, and I continue to ask people, like, if anyone ever does a experiment on following where does the water we drink actually go, like, I think this is a crucial experiment that I have never been able to find anything about. I've asked multiple departments from multiple universities if they've ever seen anything. They've not seen anything. Obviously, we have like total body water measurements and stuff, but not where does the water we actually drink or where does the fluid we actually drink go. And so, how much of the water or how much of the urine is from the water we drink versus the water we produce? That's a good question. And, based off of like things like the lymphatics and what it seems like is happening to lymphatics and stuff, I almost wonder if the edema is kind of whatever little water we are making in the mitochondria that's just not able to find its way out. And then potentially some of it is coming still from the water we drink too. But I don't know. And I think it's a good question that, 60 years later, we still don't really have an answer to. So
I think it goes back to Gilbert Ling's discussion of, like if you think of liquid water versus then if you bloom gelatin in water, that becomes very different consistencies. But think of the sheer amount of space that, let's say you had a cup of water and then you added gelatin to that cup of water, it literally takes up less space.
Exactly.
So is that playing into this as well? We're not seeing the proper structure of the water throughout the cell. And you have to beat that biology textbook cell structure out of your head because that just doesn't exist in the, Gilbert Ling ideology of what an actual cell is.
Yeah.
So maybe there just isn't proper structuring of water and that is presenting itself as edema.
Right. And so now the cells are swollen and now you're just bigger by nature of the fact that the cells are swollen. And obviously like we know that the water characteristics of structured water is different than unstructured water. And, this kind of gets back into what we were just talking about potassium, magnesium versus calcium and sodium. And calcium and sodium is in the unstructured bag of water versus the potassium and magnesium in the kind of structured, more gelatin-like water. And, this then gets into, we talked like kind of ad nauseum about the GI, but like everyone's talking about like leaky gut and stuff. Well, it's like, if you imagine, so you're like 1 cell thick GI, your small intestine, like they're supposed to be kind of in these kind of structured, more it's like curved rectangular type shapes, the cells. Well, if you imagine now they're like unstructured and now they're more like a balloon. And so now you have like balloons sitting next to each other. Well, it's like, okay, well, you could see how things could more easily get through these gaps versus if it was more like a brick, basically, and like laying bricks next to each other. But yeah, I think that there's just so much research that we haven't done, and it's been over 60 years, and it's like, why haven't we done this? I think this entire book would be great for like a grad student to comb through and be like, that sounds interesting. Like, let me go explore that more.
And one more thing back on like the, non-structured water versus structured water. You have to have proper electrolyte balance to have structured water. Like you can't have structured water without proper a mineral status and electrolyte status.
Yeah, and that's kind of what gets me about like the minerals are everything people. It's like, well, yes, minerals are very important. You need to make sure you're getting the RDAs, like all of that stuff. But like, again, if those minerals are not getting into the cell, if we're not even like using the full TCA, the full ETC, like it really doesn't matter about your mineral status, right? Like it kind of goes hand in hand with what we're discussing here. So the next quote that I had is this semi-starved individual will not produce a concentrated urine when placed on a water restricted regimen. So no matter what, the kidneys are like, nope, we're not putting anything into this urine. Like we're not letting it go.
Isn't that amazing? It's easier for the kidney to just pass like non-concentrated urine water through than it is to mobilize the toxins into the urine and pass those out.
I have a question. What would somebody be looking for as far as sediments in their urine? Like you said, you saw a bunch of sediment.
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm weird, but every single time I go to the bathroom, I look, what's in the bowl? Maybe people don't do that, but I do.
What does my pee look like today?
Yeah, because like you can learn, you see like foam and stuff, like, and that's another kind of indication to me that I'm starting to get a little bit more on the kind of LEA state, when I start to see a little bit more foam and stuff. But you can also see a little bit more foam like after lifting and stuff, so it's not always necessarily a negative thing, right? But those tend to be like your glucuronidation products and stuff. So like say you're just excreting more estrogen that day, like that's a good thing, right? Like no one would necessarily say that's a bad thing. Well, depending upon the person, I guess they would potentially say that's a bad thing. The estrogen maximalists out there. But anyways, like so you can see different things in your urine, and then obviously like if you take a B complex that has any sufficient amount of riboflavin in it, you're going to see your urine color change because of the riboflavin. So I just am looking for changes in my urine. Every so often I'll just check the like pH of the urine, because like optimally urine pH should be about 6.4 to 6.8, like slightly acidic. But yeah.
What about like smell? Like just example, asparagus.
So Kathleen, what Sarah's asking is that you need to make a Bristol stool chart, but for pee.
Well, I'm just for people to take a practical step after this podcast.
Yeah.
They need to be able to know what to look for.
Yeah. So again, I think urine pH is something great to look at. Like that can tell you a lot, right? And typically if your urine pH is too acidic, like in the 5s, like mine was, when I was deep in the LEA, mine was like 4.3 or something like that. It was like real acidic. And again, like pH it's not a linear scale, right? It's like a base 10 scale. So 4.3 is very different from 6.4. And so a lot of people are like, oh, I need to eat like alkaline foods and stuff. But so this is where like things like sufficient potassium, calcium, etc. come in. Baking soda can help. Zinc really, really helps if you have kind of too acidic urine. And then too basic urine, it kind of depends on like what you need. You basically just have to keep. Basically, if you get the RDAs, a lot of that stuff starts to fix this, right? Like me getting the RDAs of calcium is what started to bring my very acidic urine back up into the normal range.
Well, I think what you just said is very important. Like use your pee as a gauge,
right.
But don't let it like identify you, and instead use it as like, hey, I'm heading in the right direction.
Exactly. Yeah. 100%.
I have my pee is bad. I'm in a bad state. No. Maybe run pH. You can get pH strips on Amazon. Kathleen actually had us measure the pH of our urine. You can get pH strips on Amazon.
And they're pretty cheap too. Like just get the regular chemistry pH strip.
And you can use that as a gauge.
Yeah.
And so what would someone want to be shooting for heading in the right direction?
Yeah. So again, like kind of the optimal urine pH is said to be about 6.4 to 6.8, depending upon the strip that you get. Anywhere from like 6 to 7, I would say is what I would look for. Too basic is a problem, just like in our blood, right? Like too basic is a problem, too acidic is a problem. And so we kind of want to adjust that. But, back to the asparagus thing, like if you smell asparagus in your urine, that's not necessarily a problem. Some people, I believe some people smell it and some people don't smell it, but just like, you'll see if you have like a really brightly colored pigmented food, you might see residue of that in your feces, and that's okay, right? It's more so if you start to see, and like for example, say you take some calcium D-glucarate, well, you're probably going to see more glucuronidation products in your urine, and that's okay. Like that's not necessarily a problem. It's, kind of looking at these cycles over time and stuff. That's why, again, I just have kind of gotten in the habit of like, okay, I just see what's in the toilet bowl after going to the bathroom to see like, do I notice big swings? And if I do notice big swings or, big changes, like, okay, maybe that I start to question like, what did I change? Or did I have a couple poor nights of sleep? Or, am I jet lagged? Like literally whatever it is. But it kind of gives you clues as to how you're functioning.
And then in terms of like pee color, obviously if your pee is like extra bright yellow, you probably need a little bit more fluid. But I think just a sign, if you're peeing all the time and your pee is very clear, that's a low energy availability state potentially.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And I found it very interesting. So during the refeeding period, they still at 12 weeks of refeeding, it was the amount of urine that they were producing was almost as marked as it was at the end of the starvation period. It was surprising that the group receiving the smallest number of calories was the only group that showed a definitely reduced urine volume. There's no obvious explanation for this.
So then the last part of this chapter, they talk about what happened in the MSE. So again, they do a literature review. of previous studies. And then they talk about, okay, what happened with kidney function in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment.
Yeah. And I think this quote is very interesting too. They say the excretion of urea. So again, this is from the urea cycle. This is again why, I think this kind of push or trope of more protein, the better, is potentially an issue for a lot of people, because you're now putting a lot of stress on the urea cycle, and not a lot of people have sufficient micronutrients, I would say, for the urea cycle. And then you create a lot of nitrogen waste compounds that can be like toxic to you and stuff. So it is, if you're doing well with your high protein diet, I'm not saying to necessarily change it, but I'm saying like if you're starting to feel certain effects and stuff, maybe this is potentially a reason why. But anyways, so excretion of urea accounts for roughly 75 to 80% of the work done by the kidney in a normal state. A good deal can be learned from considering the work involved in the excretion of urea. So again, like this is why I think, it can be, again, don't become like, don't become like so concerned about your urine, but I do think that it can be a good thing to like just check. It's like when we measure our blood pressure, right? Like, the big issues we're seeing are big excursions from your mean. So you basically figure out like, what is your mean? What do your like day-to-days look like? And if you see big changes from that, then it's like, okay, we get a little bit interested in why.
So back on what you talked about in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, just as a reminder, they cut calories and then they went through a refeeding phase after the 12 weeks of cutting calories, which they did it in different paces. So they had some groups where they added calories very quickly, other groups where they added calories a little bit slower. And it showed that the normal urine volume was almost the best in the slowest calorie adding. And I think that that's just yet another sign, a consistent trend that we've talked about in all the podcast episodes so far, is going slow out of a semi-starvation state. Because if you're going from very little amount of food to then like rapidly adding food back in, that is a huge stress on the body.
Right.
And it's throwing it out of balance again. And it's still not going to be able to find this new homeostasis. So again, just going slow.
And again, I think this is a reason or an argument for not super physiologic dosing things, supplements, when you're in this LEA state, because you're just putting more and more stress on first pass liver, the kidney, like all of that stuff. And like, do you, yes, these things might be what you need, but do you have the like cells, first of all, and then like the adequate like energy for those cells to then handle, the excess or even just the recycling, the use of, etc., these things. So yeah, obviously there can be an argument for someone that needs to go a little bit faster and stuff, but I do think, again, time and again from reading the MSD, I think the slower the better.
So then they wanted to find a way to like assess kidney function. Like, hey, how can we grade how well your kidney is doing? And so they assessed the quote renal osmotic work done by the kidney with urea excretion, and they saw a noticeable drop. So the plot is like a U-shaped curve. So the control period, it was like, I think I got the table here, 13 grams per day. And then at the end of the semi-starvation, it dropped nearly in half to 7.42. And then by the refeeding period, week 12, it went back up to 14. So just showing like the usefulness of the kidney, the proper work done was decreased.
Right.
And so the body was just making adaptations given the low energy coming in.
Yeah. And people will say, well, they're in a negative nitrogen balance. So, if anything, the kidney's not getting as much urea, and that's the reason why there's the decrease and stuff. And yes, like that is true. But at the same time, I also think that it comes down to, because you also see the concentration difference compared to the water and stuff. And so you always have to keep in mind like the total volume. And I think that's where the issue comes in.
Okay. I'm sorry. I really like this part, this chapter. So I took a lot of notes.
Oh, yeah.
So then they made 3 generalizations about the kidney osmotic work in a semi-starved state. First, a moderate polyuria. So again, increasing excessive peeing. That may be regarded as a useful adaptive mechanism since it reduces renal osmotic work requirements for the kidney. 2, the work of the kidney will be most influenced by the protein intake of the semi-starvation diet and will be reduced roughly in proportion to this reduction. So that point makes me question, what about people who are eating a low calorie diet, high protein intake? That could cause more stress on the kidney.
Right.
And then 3, the advantage in renal work produced by the 2 preceding generalizations can be offset by a marked restriction of salt. So it just brings up that third point. It can be offset by a restriction of salt. There's this group in the carnivore space right now that is saying you should not be salting your food at all and you'll feel much better.
Mm-hmm.
So that made me think of that point as well. When you're not eating potassium, not eating salt may actually be better for balancing your electrolytes, because then you're not flushing the system with a ton of salt.
Yeah, especially because there is some potassium in meat. It's just not as much as like a potato, for example. And so in order to keep that kind of balance, because like I know that they dropped the recommended potassium RDA. It used to be like above 5,000 or something. I think they dropped it back to like in the 3,000s. But the like sodium RDA is way less than that. And so if you're trying to keep these things balanced, it would make sense that, not to do that. I think the potential issue though that people run into is that they just drop their carbohydrates. And because of that, they're now like trying to maintain water, electrolyte status, etc. And so they start to get these really intense salt cravings. And then they basically like take all of the salt. And then once they're there, it then becomes very difficult for them to pull back on that salt in order to do what you just said, where you basically don't, where you restrict salt in order to protect against some of the changes.
That's all I had for chapter 31, renal function. Any other notes on kidney?
No.
Any questions on kidney?
I think that was it. Yeah, the kidneys are very crucial. This is why there's a huge push for people to be kidney donors and stuff like that. So I would, definitely try to take care of them, because that's it.
So chapter 32 is special senses. Kathleen, you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, so I love how they kind of start off the chapter, and I really love how they do kind of like a literature review first, and then they talk about the MSC, and I love that they break up the literature review like in the specific chapters, because I think that's great. But so they say folk wisdom that hunger sharpens the senses. So a lot of people believe, oh, when I fast, when I go, whatever, my senses are sharpened. And they really call into question that in this chapter, which I really, really appreciate, because I think you get this illusion that your senses are sharpened, but they're not necessarily sharpened. And so they very much, like I said, call into question that. And they do talk about the differences between the senses that people experience eating more of a Western diet versus an Eastern diet at this stage. And I think they get into that in the motor performance chapter too. But they do see big differences between the Eastern diet versus the Western diet. And they think that that more so you had like way worse symptoms from the Eastern diet. And I think that had a lot more to do with deficiencies or potentially some type of toxin or something in their diet versus the Western diet. But yeah, so they see lower, and so like changes to the sight, so like reduced night vision, and they see changes to intraocular pressure. So they do see lower intraocular pressure, which a lot of people say, well, that's a positive thing, because a lot of people have high intraocular pressure and high blood pressure and stuff. But that was on the onset of fasting. They didn't talk about like what potentially happened like down the road and stuff, so we don't know. But they do see, though, the opacity of the crystalline lens become analogous to the changes present in old age. And so a lot of people, you see, they have issues with, their actual lens and stuff. And so is that more because of an LEA state? That and again, like, is old age, like, yes, eventually all of us are going to die, but it's like, can we maintain a health state with our life, or a health span with our lifespan versus just a lifespan? And so, can we potentially limit the change to the lens of the eye? They bring that into question. Anything else with the eye?
Honestly, I think that they presented a convincing argument that senses were downregulated slightly. However, one of my biggest takeaways from this chapter that they even pointed out was that on the whole, your special senses are probably the least impacted by a semi-starved state relative to any other. So like, for example, we've clearly documented that liver function suffers, kidney function suffers, digestive system function suffers. But what is the most important thing for a survival of an organism? And that is senses, because you're interacting with your environment, and knowing what's happening in your environment is essential for your survival. So senses are like one of those like vital functions for your survival. And so it's maybe the least impacted by an LEA state.
Right.
However, there are still some documents that it's down-regulated and hindered.
Right. Like, so you maintain your baseline of senses, because we know that the brain and the nervous system basically loses no mass, is hardly impacted. And so you're maintaining this baseline, but because of the fact that you're maintaining this baseline and everything else is degrading, you kind of get this weird relative issue where it's like, oh, it seems like this is getting better. And it's like, well, is it really getting better, or is it just maintaining and everything else is getting way worse? And so that's why this kind of illusion that it seems like it's getting better is happening.
Yep. And honestly, something that I can relate to is this sensitivity to sound.
I was going to say that the tolerance for loud music is lowered.
They say, yeah. And they talk about how in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, they started conversing in very low tones. And like, I can relate to that.
Yeah. Also, like, just think of, I mean, even in like TV shows and movies and stuff, when there's somebody displayed that, like, let's say they're in a nightclub and there's loud music and they're like closing their ears and they're looking sensitive. They're usually a frail individual, like a smaller human who's kind of like, seems like that would be the typical response for somebody of that size. Not that you always have to be small to be starved.
Right.
But yeah, I can definitely relate to that. It's like, you have less tolerance for pretty much everything. It's just, and that's why I remember in the beginning we talked about like social isolation.
Right.
You just kind of isolate yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. They see some daylight aversion, which that was 100% me. I talked about how I would come back from classes and like shut off all the lights and draw the blinds. I could not handle being outside. A lot of people can't handle being outside. They blame it on histamine, but it's like, is it really histamine, or is it, something else? The sound sensitivity, and then also the like smell sensitivity, and how many people have like multiple chemical sensitivity. And like yes, some of it, like, I do believe, if you're on the freeway and you're smelling like some truck or whatever burning something, that like, yeah, you should have an aversion to that. Like, I do believe.
Or if you walk into Bath and Body Works.
Right. Yeah. Like that I think is like a normal physiological process. I kind of call into question, like, are you really paying attention to like the world around you? Which a lot of people don't, right? Because in this state, they become very internal, like you said, like social isolation. And so they don't even notice these things. And then to a point where it's like, now you have things like MCS where it's like, boom, like you must pay attention to this now, Yeah.
I loved so in this part about, tolerance for, they said tolerance for loud music, speech, and noises was lowered. They provided a mechanical explanation. And it's just something no one would think about, because we've talked about how when in a low energy availability state, things shrink because there's not enough energy to maintain structure. So they say the mechanical explanation, the auditory acuity is related to the free lumen of the external auditory canal. In semi-starvation, two factors that may increase this free lumen space: first, less earwax, and two, the lumen is determined by bony framework and soft tissues covering it. In starvation, these tissues become thinner, so the channel becomes larger. So again, I think it's helpful to think these things. When you change structure, you're changing function and capacity.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting about the earwax, because like one of my signs, again, that like I'm starting to head into the state, is I get a increased production of earwax at first, and then it drops off. So I wonder if they like had paid attention to that, if they would have noticed that. That could also just be like unique to me because of my potential issues with using fatty acids and stuff. But yeah, I find that very interesting personally.
Kathleen really documents her urine and her earwax. We open Kathleen's cabinets. There's just like jars.
My pee tests for the last 12 years. I've saved all my urine.
I don't. It's more like very just, you just start to notice things, right? Like about yourself. It's like, oh yeah, okay, that, I noticed it.
Yeah. And you can like, you pull out your headphones sometimes and there's earwax. You can notice it.
Yeah. I know we're not supposed to clean with Q-tips and stuff, but what?
I know. But there's this like it was advertised towards me, but there's like a corkscrew thing. Have you seen that?
I have.
Have you used that before?
I haven't used it. I'm so like, you know, my hearing and my eyes are two things that I'm just like, I've always been very like sensitive about, of like, oh my God, you know, when people would start throwing things around in class and stuff, I would be like, oh, like don't hit my eyes. So I'm very cautious of accidentally like hitting the eardrum, which is like difficult to do, but still like that, yeah. And like, I cannot have people put makeup on my eyes, because I like, you know, especially like mascara and stuff, I see like the thing coming at me and I'm like, oh no, I can barely do it myself.
Oh my gosh, you would have died. Brandon just got LASIK.
Oh no.
done, and they had to slice a line in his eye and then peel back a layer.
Yeah.
You would have passed out.
Yeah,
Can you imagine not being able to blink? Like there's a machine
and like
holding your eye.
like, how much trauma is this for the human body? Just like we're talking about right now, like your senses stay heightened.
Yeah.
Or they at least don't decline.
Right.
So somebody has like a claw and your eyes are open. You can't close them. They're coming at you with a knife.
Yeah, it's like dental work too, where they like keep your mouth pried open. So I know.
Yeah. I don't think anybody in a LEA state would be able to go through something like that. It's just
Pretty traumatic.
Yeah, very traumatic.
Yeah.
Okay, anything from chapter 32?
Yeah, I think that was the rest. It's a shorter chapter.
Yeah.
But it's still interesting. But yeah, I think that was it.
Chapter 33, I think, is great. Every chapter is great.
Yeah.
Neuromuscular functions and motor performance. So how many people these days are dealing with, you know, fatigue or issues with reflexes and things like that? And you've got to think about, when you're in a low energy availability state, your brain and the rest of your body are, of course, going to have delayed communications.
Yeah.
And that's going to impact how you operate in space, your vestibular sense. And that is very well documented in the MSC. So do you want to kick us off with this chapter?
Yeah, really fast. I have my own anecdotes about this, of course, too. They talk a lot about the patella reflex. So that's when they, you know, I don't know how many doctors still do it, but they take that kind of like hammer thing and they like hit the kind of base at your knee, the patella tendon, and it's supposed to cause your leg, like basically to jolt forward, your lower leg to come forward. Well, when when I went into the hospital for those 10 days, they cannot elicit any kind of patella reflex. They cannot elicit any kind of Achilles reflex, which people talk about like the Achilles reflex in relation to the thyroid, right? I also had multiple, they call them like neuro exams, where they use like a sharp tool on the like palms of your hands, the soles of your feet. No reflex, no like, oh, that tickles. They also do like, they take like a tuning fork, they hit it so it's vibrating, and so you're trying to feel that too. Yeah, no kind of response to that either. So firsthand have definitely experienced a lot of what the case studies talk about, and then what some of the men experience. So
isn't it crazy? Like when I was a kid, I remember getting that reflex test.
Yeah.
But then it seems like that's gone away.
Yeah, I know.
When was the last time you had a primary checkup?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So starting off, this is where they really kind of separate the kind of diet of the East versus the West. And there was a lot. So like we discussed, the neurological, during the MSC and during pseudo-starvation, it seems like the nervous system is pretty well maintained, except for not in the East. And they think that there is possibly something to do with vitamin deficiencies and potentially a toxic factor or multiple toxic factors that people in the East experienced. And, you know, we know with vitamin deficiencies, for example, B1, B12, all of these are crucial, you know, enough choline for acetylcholine, like all these are crucially important for the myelin sheath, the nerve impulse, acetylcholine, all of that stuff. So if someone is, again, this is why it is important to get 100% or, you know, plus of the theoretical RDAs. Again, I think it's more important to get it from food, because I think that there is something to the food matrix and the quote unquote field and stuff, but people might disagree with me about that.
So one thing that they noted in the background review part of this chapter, the vestibulary chronaxy. Again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, so I had to look this up. So the vestibulary chronaxy refers to the minimum time required for an electrical stimulus of double the rheobase to stimulate the vestibular system. So essentially the time it takes for, an electrical stimulus from the brain to actually reach where it wants to go. And the system is responsible for balance and spatial orientation in the body, and it's housed within the inner ear. So they talked about a study of emaciated men in 1946, and this vestibulary chronaxy increased from the normal level of 12 to 22 up to 300. So a very noticeable time delay of, an electrical stimulus release and then its impact.
Right. Yeah. Another quote that I have, they were discussing semi-starved children, and they disclosed normal or slightly diminished nervous excitability. The frequently diminished tendon reflexes are another symptom of decreased reactivity of the somatic nervous system. How many people are talking about somatic exercises and stuff nowadays? I find that interesting. The activity and excitability of the autonomic nervous system were also decreased. There were bradycardia, so lowering the heart rate, and lower arterial blood pressure. The excitability was studied by administration of adrenaline and pilocarpine. Adrenaline acting on the orthosympathetic centers produced very little or no increase in pulse rate and blood pressure. The pilocarpine, a parasympathetic excitant, produced little change in the flow of saliva or in sweating. The size of the pupils was only slightly affected. So this is why I've had people do orthostatic tolerance tests, and then also the pupil test, where you're in a dark room and you shine a light and you see does the pupil dilate, contract, does it go back and forth, etc. Because you do see a change in response to, so even though the nervous system is maintained, you can see a change in response to the way that the peripheral and the autonomic nervous system is actually functioning. So I find that very interesting that they gave adrenaline and a parasympathetic excitant, and they didn't see any change, because again, we see this all the time with giving things like TRT and other thyroid, where you give the hormone, the neurotransmitter, whatever, and you don't see any change, or sometimes you see a negative change. So
in their quote field reports from European areas, they noted a number of neurological disturbances in undernutrition states. So decreased or diminished sense of sensation, particularly touch, numbness, tingling, burning, reduction or absence of knee and ankle jerks, weaknesses in muscles, and muscle contractions looked different on electrical stimulation graphs, and tendon reflexes were diminished and exaggerated, and there was a lot of cases of neuropathy as well. So that's what I wrote down from their field reports from European countries.
Yeah.
You didn't mention the pigmentation, the yellow coloring of the skin.
So they noticed,
he talks about the beta carotene,
particularly in areas where there was skin sensitivity issues, it seemed to coincide with peculiar yellow coloration. And Dr. Ray Pete talks about this a lot. When in a low thyroid state, you become extremely sensitive to beta carotene, and you can see that show up in your skin.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an interesting thing that correlated here. Those areas where there was potentially some skin sensitivity, but now, you have the vitamin A toxicity groups and all of that. But yeah, that's a good point.
Well, and it makes sense that they have more beta carotene, right? Because if there's no food, you're going to eat whatever, even if it's grass, right? You're going to want to fill your stomach with something. And so obviously there's a fair amount of beta carotene in grass and other plants. And so it makes sense why they would have seen higher levels of it.
They were eating weeds.
Yeah. A lot of people today, though, do have I've had the orange hands before.
Yeah.
Not anymore, but yeah, you can tell pretty soon if you're consuming too much, or that your body can handle at this moment.
Exactly. Yeah. I really find the pupil responses interesting. They noted that the pupils were usually constricted and sometimes reacted slowly and weakly to light. So again, this kind of goes back to this aversion to sunlight and not wanting to be in bright lights. And, obviously I do believe that there is a problem with LEDs because it's only taking a very small part of the spectrum and stuff. But I also wonder how much of people's negative responses to LED lights and stuff have a lot to do with this, right? Because you go outside in the sunlight, you're getting the full blue spectrum at even a higher lux, higher intensity, right, than an LED light. And so sometimes I wonder about that. But again, that's not me promoting LED lights. I do think we should be outside in the sun, not getting sunburns, getting the full spectrum, like all of that stuff. I just want to make that clear.
So the neuropathy paragraph I thought was interesting. So some patients complained of terrible pricklings and stabbing pains in the feet, calves, and thighs, as well as in the hands and forearms. The skin of the feet became hyper aesthetic to touch and warmth, whereas during the day, the feet felt frequently insensible and cold as ice. At night, under the blankets, they would begin to feel hot like fire. The patients got some relief by cooling the feet in the air, walking barefoot on the floor, or wrapping the feet in clothes wrung out in cold water. At times, the acute sensation of cold in the extremities during the day became very painful, and sometimes the painful cold sensation passed into the sensation of burning heat. In these patients, no true beriberi and little classical pellagra was observed. Neither purified thiamine nor niacin was effective in the treatment of these nervous system disturbances. Success was reported with the use of dry yeast, and then obviously with nutrition. So I thought that Sarah could maybe talk about a little bit of her experience here.
This is literally my experience. I remember, so cold during the day, and then at night it would be like.
This is when you and Kathleen connected.
Yeah, this is why we're friends, because Kathleen was the first person, and you had hypothesized it was something to do with B vitamins. So it's interesting that they said that I think they said it wasn't.
Yeah,
I mean, not that it's
B1 and B3 didn't help, but the yeast helped. So I wonder if it
doesn't yeast have like a full complex.
Yeah. And so it's not that it wasn't related to B vitamin deficiency, because you do see this in B vitamin deficiency, but perhaps it's just different here. But I remember one night I had to like walk out into the snow barefoot because I felt like my feet were on fire.
Yeah.
I don't even like talking about this because I've done so much nervous system work to just like disassociate with this part of me. But
yeah, it's okay. We don't have to talk about it.
Yeah, it's actually crazy though. And I still don't know why I experienced this. And I don't, because what we talk about in this MSC series is that restriction of carbohydrate could lead to the semi-starved state, just like low calories, because it's not like throughout the time that I experienced this, I was in a semi-starved state. I had actually already gone through the refeeding post carnivore and doing bikini competition. But we also had moved into mold. I do wonder if like there was the decreased ability for my body to detox at that time. But then also we've seen in some of the sections when the patient does start to refeed, they actually get the intensified symptoms. And so I'm wondering if it was just like a perfect collision of all of that. And then that's why I started to experience this. And perhaps before it was just my body was trying to keep me safe. It was so numbed down that it couldn't even express this yet.
Right. Yeah.
I am so proud of how she's come out of that state.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And I've watched the whole thing. And I think, you kind of think of like the stress bucket, right? And maybe like the mold exposure was just something that like tipped it off.
Exactly.
But the fact that you have overcome that, like, guys, I don't think you realize this.
I still have cold feet during the day. That is the one thing that Kathleen and I just like, I can't figure out.
Okay, that's very important. All of us deal with things. This Minnesota Starvation Experiment was 12 weeks of being in a semi-starved state. Think of how many years in your life you were in a semi-starved state.
Well, and again, they during the 50-year follow-up, some of these men still had issues and stuff. And so I'm not saying that like everyone is always going to have an issue from this, because I think that is very like down, in a way. But I think being aware of this and then taking action of like, okay, now I'm aware of this. Like, can I refeed? Can I play around with my macros? Can I play around with getting enough, micros? Can I play around with the lifestyle stuff in order to not end up like some of the men that still had symptoms, 50 years later?
And something that Kathleen brings up a lot is like part of being a human is having symptoms.
Right.
There is literally nowhere. And Kathleen read these like older reports of women that were still having fertility issues like way back in the day.
Yeah.
And there's no perfection.
Right.
It's like a relative scale of tolerability of certain things that you're dealing with. And so we don't want these conversations to be encouraging you to seek perfection,
Right.
because there's no, you are a human being living in an environment that's ever changing.
Right.
And so developing a level of resiliency and also understanding, like being like Kathleen and looking at your pee,
Right.
understanding when you're like, oh, I've pushed myself too much. I need to, you know, put myself under a little bit less stressful conditions right now, let my LEA state kind of pass. It's okay to go through these things. It's just tuning in and recognizing what you're experiencing is your body telling you, hey, maybe I don't have enough energy reserves right now to meet the demands, and that's okay. It's not you being broken.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify too, like, I don't study my pee. It's literally like I glance at it, I flush the toilet. Like, it's like as I'm going to flush the toilet, I glance at it, and
No, she has the cupboards.
and it usually like it usually lines up with my kind of subjective feeling in my body. Like, I don't need, you know, a wearable to tell me that I got poor sleep last night or that I'm like low on energy, right? Like, I can just feel it. And I think, you know, I think going through this process, in many ways, I'm very grateful for it, because I know so much about myself now. And I know that, like, okay, if I'm starting to feel like this, I know that, like, if I do these things, that typically takes care of it. And so I think it's a very, you know, it was, you know, in many ways horrible to go through it, but it was very rewarding now to be on the other end. Yeah.
And then one more note about, you know, neuropathy and these other things is they did note that neurological improvements are slower to improve after the refeeding relative to any other conditions that they saw in the MSE.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? Because it's like the brain, the nervous system, spinal cord, like that for the most part was spared when it comes to, you know, loss of mass. But like, why is it that takes so much longer? And I think there's a lot there. Like, if anything, the cells in kind of the nervous system are more long-lived cells. And so I think it takes longer to get to the point where they're turning over, and like kind of new cells with new information, all of that stuff are like coming in to replace them. So again, that's kind of where this like 7 to 10 year thing comes in, I think, because of that. So, but
I think you brought that up in a different podcast. So we talked about like the gut cells technically will die. Their life cycle is 3 days.
Right.
So you can see noticeable gut health improvements
Real
in
fast.
a shorter period of time.
Yeah.
Didn't you say that some of the, you know, neuro cells, didn't you say they were like 7 years?
Yeah. And there's like one cell line that it's like 70 years. So it's like, you're probably, you know, really never going to see this like turnover. And that, you know, that's unfortunate. However, the like positive thing about that is that it's not like a cell line that, you know, it's not like, yes, it's a detriment that it's not necessarily the best, but it's not a detriment that it's not the best. You know, like, obviously, like, if your GI only turned over once every 70 years and you like damaged it, well, you're kind of screwed at that point, right? But like, the cells that really matter, they tend to turn over a little bit faster. And so that's a good thing. That's why this is not just a light switch where it's like, okay, we get to the end of this time period and it's like, you know, we're good to go again. It's like, no, we're slowly improving over time. And yes, like Ash brought up, like, you know, you're never going to be 100%. And that's why, again, you know, I think we've talked about this, where like, you really need to define for yourself, what does health look like to you? And then when you reach that point, like, stop searching, like please go live, you know, like go do, you know, stop being like, there's the whole idea of the Pareto principle, right? Like the 20% of things that give you the 80% effect. And for me, like, that's what I'm looking for. Those 20% of things that give me the 80% effect. And I just don't have this, especially as a mom to 2 children, 2 sons, like, I don't have the time to go out and find the rest of the 80% that gives me the 20%. You know, like, yes, I'm looking for things here and there and stuff, but like, it's just impossible, you know? And so I would just like challenge someone, like, be okay with the 80%, because 80%, I mean, at least where I was, like, 80% is huge to me, you know, like, I couldn't walk at one time. And so the fact that I can like go run, and yes, sometimes I have to like moderate my volume and stuff like that. And I still get some issues with post-exercise malaise and stuff like that. But like, the fact that I can do those things now, I'm very much grateful for that. And I'm just going to continue doing that versus being like, I got to find the next thing that's going to get me, you know, the remaining 20%, 10 to 20%. So.
Because it's kind of like the S-shaped curve.
Right.
Once you get to a certain point, the increase is so slow,
Right.
and you're going to be spending the rest of your life trying to get more and more frustrated that you're not seeing improvements. And in the current health space, it's very easy to go down one rabbit hole to the next rabbit hole to the next one because of just like abundant access to information.
Right. Yeah.
I think that it, like, you have, when we're speaking about this, we have to be considerate of like the issues that affect some people that severely impact their quality of life on a regular daily basis. Like I think insomnia is something like that. I think if somebody is still going through neuropathy, that impacts the quality of your life on a day-to-day basis. You can't just simply forget about that.
Yeah.
You're constantly reminded. So tackling those,
Right.
once you, I guess what we're
That's the
trying to say is
80%.
once you tackle those, everything else becomes smaller and more approachable. And that's where you can start living. Like, yes, you still need to live your life while you're dealing with those other things, but you also, it's really hard.
Yeah. I want to clarify that too. When I was in the deep end, so to speak, like I was all focused on that. I was focused on coming out of that. And that's kind of what led me to this in the first place, because everything I tried failed. And basically what I was left with was going very, very slow, very slowly increasing food, very slowly finding, a couple supplements that seemed to help, and in building from there. So, I don't want to say that like you just wish these things away or you don't pay attention to them. Obviously, when you're in this state, like you want to find that 20% that gives you the 80%. But then once you're there, I think, moving away from the constant like body focus, I think is important. And you, I mean, I think you both have experienced this too. Like you naturally do that. Like in my experience, people and myself, like we naturally start to move away from the kind of more internal focus of control to like this more external, we start to give more, we start to do more.
Because there's enough mental energy to do that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I think, Kathleen, what you've said before is like when a client stops messaging you as much, you're like, oh, they're doing better.
Yeah.
Because they're not constantly bombarding you with like, Kathleen, help me with this.
Yeah. And I don't like sometimes saying that, because then I'm like, I don't know if the client then is going to hear that and be like, oh, I shouldn't message her. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to like create that like thing. But at the same time, it is true. It's like, when we're in the state, and again, I was there, like I responded to everything I took. And so I would swing back and forth. Like I would, start to feel a little bit better. Then I would take something and I'd feel horrible again. And so, you're constantly focused on, okay, I just did this and it caused this. Why did that happen? All of that. And so you're kind of in many ways like neurotic. And I don't mean that to be, mean, but like that's what's going on. And in many ways you kind of have to, because it's like your survival at this point. But we want to find things again slowly that are moving us away from that point where, yes, we still have some neuroticism about our health, our well-being, all of that stuff. But then, we can kind of start to give to other people. I think that is a big part of the human condition. So
Definitely.
So to the end part of this chapter, speaking of like neurological conditions. So neurological, that's going to impact your reflexes and your senses, but it's also going like neuromuscular, right? So your muscles require signaling from your brain to function properly. So I think a lot of people can relate to this section when they're talking about neuromuscular disturbances. And they mentioned an experiment similar to the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, where food intake was reduced from the control of 3,400 calories. So again, these are like not overweight individuals, like 150-pound men. So they went from their normal calories of 3,400 down to 1,700. That is like the common that people are consuming today.
Yeah.
And the most frequent,
men.
Yes.
Yeah.
The most frequent complaints were muscular aches, weakness, paresthesias in the limbs, and the limbs like going to sleep.
Yeah, I had all of this. The paresthesias, that's this like feeling that something is like moving on your skin, or like you get this like sensation on your skin, and it for some people it becomes very intense, and they're like scratch off their skin, and like it's really weird, and it does not feel that good.
Well, kind of related to that, I wonder if, going back to the neuropathy, if they did those, I don't know what the tests are called, but basically where they're testing like whether or not you have any sort of impaired sensations in whether your nerve signaling is working down in your feet and stuff. I wonder if they were to have tested the patients, if they would have positively or negatively, I don't know, like the right result of that test. But like when I got those tests done, nothing was wrong. So nothing was showing up that it was actually some sort of
When you had a nerve conduction study, is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
Nothing showed up.
Did you have an EMG done too?
I believe so.
Where they stick the needle in you and then they send the electrical signal through it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I wonder if they would have tested that, if they would have actually seen that there was something wrong.
So they do reference this. They say on electrical stimulation, the muscular contractions in semi-starved individuals differed from those in normal persons. This is my experience, but I do think that, Sarah, there's probably there's like a threshold, or there's some type of point where this happens. So what I'm saying is that I think you can still have symptoms and still show quote unquote normal nerve signals, muscular contractions, etc., until you can't anymore.
But I think that, the fact that Sarah's didn't show a problem, but then she still had symptoms, that's where the power of this last part of the chapter comes in, because they share direct reports from these patients.
Exactly. Yeah. I think those quotes will be great.
Like they say, the prisoners working in the machine shop and operating envelope folding machines were forced to reduce the work output, and some had to quit completely. Ordinary activities such as making up the bed, cleaning the cell, climbing stairs, or courtyard exercise became difficult and fatiguing. Some of the patients asked for canes in order to have support during exercise. Others, who were very weak, reported that while standing or walking, they felt their legs would not carry them and their knees would buckle. In walking in the prison, they held onto the furniture. Not infrequently, they fell upon standing up. In addition to muscular weakness, vertigo was said to have played a role in this. Some patients became awkward in handling objects, and in writing, they frequently dropped their eating utensils on the floor. So even if there weren't statistically significant changes in, muscle testing, the symptoms showed that there were implications to this LEA state on, neuromuscular function.
Yeah. They say, to finish, that only a limited number presented evidence of disturbed function. So this is what you're talking about, Sarah, that such as alterations of cutaneous sensitivity and abolished tendon reflexes. Hyperesthesia, hypoesthesia, and anesthesia were observed rarely and were limited to small areas. On compression, the calves and thighs were frequently painful. That 100% me. And to be honest, I still deal with my calves and thighs being a little bit painful on compression, but I think that's more to do with the lipedema and the fibrosis that is built up because of that, versus this part being still an LEA issue.
Sarah's 100%, in the MSE, same thing that Sarah brought up. There was no significant changes in the sensory tests for the MSE patients, yet we see these huge changes in the observations and the reports. And so again, it goes back to, mainstream medicine, so focused on blood work. Oh, you're fine. But the body maintains a certain range of values when you test it, because that's required. But it's kind of one of those things, if you drop a small little bit, it leads to a huge change in how that's expressed. And so relying just on testing can be dangerous, because the body has to stay within a certain period, or else you're going to die. And so you see this over and over again. My doctor said I have nothing wrong with me. My blood work is fine, yet I have all these symptoms. Well, the same thing that they found in the MSE when it comes to neuromuscular. Sometimes there weren't statistically significant changes in electrosensory testing. But wow, the reports and the observations from the experimenters, a small change can lead to a huge impact in how that's expressed.
Yeah.
This might be completely just missing the mark, but I don't know exactly why my issues happened. We have several compiling factors, but it did start to improve when I would physically scrub the bottom of my feet and remove dead skin cells and utilize different sulfur related soaps. So I also am wondering if there's any connection between overgrowth on the skin, or because of the body's reduced ability to manage and maintain a good
detoxing
microbiome. If any sort of infections were more present, or just an altered skin microbiome, because I can't discount my experience where when I did start to manage that on my feet, I think that was one of the most significant ways that I improved.
Well, Kathleen mentioned in the beginning that the skin is one of our ways to detox.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things. And when we get to the special topics section, there's a chapter about infections. And so we'll definitely talk about that then. But the other thing too is I wonder, like, just the constant input into your nervous system of like, hey, these are my feet, homunculus, like wake up, you know about the homunculus, right? It's like the like sensory view of like how our brain understands our limbs. And so like our hands, our mouth, our feet, and our genitals are like the biggest like impacts on our brain. And so I almost just wonder if like just the constant, was it specific to the like sulfur soaps or stuff, or was it just more the constant like touching that that helped to kind of reconnect those pathways and stuff? I don't know. Like I think it's probably a mixture of everything, right? It's like
one
always.
of my life's greatest mysteries, Kathleen.
But also one of your life's greatest accomplishments.
Yeah.
I still, every day when I wake up, I have a list of things and I say, I'm grateful that my feet don't bother me.
Yeah, that's great.
And then I move on.
That's awesome.
So the motor performance. So
Wait,
again,
can I add to that? I said that when they did bother me too.
Yeah.
And I still will say that.
Yeah.
It's something you just have to continuously do.
Yeah.
Okay, continue.
No, you're fine. So neurological side of things, but now neuromuscular, the motor performance in MSC, they saw a deterioration of coordination, slowing down of voluntary movements, pattern tracing, eye, hand, feet coordination. And then I think one of the most powerful parts of this chapter are the direct quotes from the patients. Do we want to read some of those?
Yeah, really fast. So they saw bodily movements were slower, but more accurate small muscle groups like typing. They saw no striking changes with that. So, I think, again, this is why a lot of people that are in an LEA state, we kind of default to our phones because in many ways it feels like we can do that and we're doing something productive. But if anything, I have found if we can kind of limit a little bit of that brain use and stuff, that will then allow for more energy for the rest of the body to handle things and stuff. So,
wow, after a really long day, that's what I kind of, go to scrolling because that's like easy at the time.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So instead of doing that, like just, sit in silence, try to sit in silence with yourself, just like be. So yeah, let's go through the quotes. I mean, if you want to read, we can go back and forth if we want to read all these quotes. I think they're very important. So that
okay, I'll start with the strength.
Okay.
So they clumped together. This is from the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. The subjects, they saved some of the things that they heard them say and then they clumped them all together into different categories: strength, speed, gross coordination, fine coordination, and endurance. So for strength, quote, lifting patients in the hospital is nowhere nearly as easy as in the control period. Quote, lifting the mattress off the bed to tuck the blankets in is a real chore. Moving furniture when cleaning is much more difficult. I notice weakness in my arms when I wash my hair in the shower. They become completely fatigued in the course of this simple operation. When I tried to open a bottle of ink, I found I could not do it, but an overhead man, not starved, did it without any trouble. It is more difficult to lift my feet, especially in trying to jump over something. I find repeatedly that my strength has decreased more than I anticipate. The carriers for the 12 urine bottles, is that Kathleen carrying her 12 urine bottles? The carriers for the 12 urine bottles are a hell of a lot heavier than when they used to. I was struck to find how difficult it was to lift a lawnmower out of a closet, end quote. So that's the strength section.
So next is speed. Quote, it is an effort to move rapidly. When the water in the showers becomes hot because of flushing of the toilets, my reaction time in adjusting controls seems to be longer than in the control period. In playing ball, I started to run after a fly, but my knees caved in and I nearly fell. It used to take me 2.5 hours or less for an 11-mile walk. Now I have to push myself to do it in 3 hours, end quote.
Sarah, do you want to do gross coordination?
Sure. Gross coordination. I tend to weave when I walk. So does that mean they're like going left and right and left and right?
Yeah. And you're like, I did this all the time. Like I'd be walking with Mark and I would just like run into him or I would like run into the wall. It was almost like I think I've said this before, but it's like almost like my brain, the mapping of my body, it didn't have the full mapping. And so it thought I was a different size than I was. And then I would just like run, because like I saw the wall, but I thought I was going to miss the wall, and I would just run right into it.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Attempting to play baseball, I was very inaccurate and weak in swinging the bat. That's me regardless. I trip over small things, can't balance on one foot anymore, have difficulty walking a straight line. I have difficulty in dodging traffic or walking in crowds where I have to start and stop and change direction. In rowing, I had difficulty in hitting the water with both oars at the same time and with equal force.
And again, these are in patients that had, quote, normal signaling in terms of like electrical testing. So again, showing like even a small change has profound impacts on how they function day to day.
So something interesting when I was reading that I thought of is like every time I've ever been in an LEA state, whether by choice through a cut or just not knowing better, I didn't even want to go do rowing. I wouldn't want to go do any of these activities because they seemed exhausting and not worth the trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I can totally relate, because then when I would be forced to go, it just wouldn't be fun. It would be like, oh my God, this is such a struggle.
Yeah.
So then fine coordination, quote, my handwriting is getting worse. Dressing takes longer. I have to really concentrate on putting on shoes, folding socks, sewing. I'm more clumsy than I used to be in lighting cigarettes. I walk unsteadily, but print well. In sewing, my movements are more jerky. In walking, I have a poor muscular control, but I can type at a high speed without errors. Again, pointing to what you said. I do not find precision work more difficult. It just takes more time. In darning, it is more difficult to do a neat job. My precision in typing, writing, or lettering is about as good as usual, but I work at a slower speed.
Whenever darning is a sewing technique for repairing holes or worn areas in fabric.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, yeah.
Okay, and then last one, endurance. Quote, while carrying a suitcase for Bob, my muscles, quote, gave way. In carrying books to the library, I needed help. In walking, I became so weak that I trouble all over. My arms become tired quickly when I'm typing. Climbing up the stadium stairs, so 2 flights, is really a fatiguing task. At one time, I could push up my body 15 times, now barely 5 times. In shop work, my ability for sustained effort has decreased, and sustained work at a high speed, as in typing, is very tiring. I mean, like, I smile and like shake my head through all these because I experienced all of these. Like I said, I was in a wheelchair. I got to the point where like I was using a cane, but in order to walk, I had to, like, all of my mental effort was put in putting one foot in front of the other, and like the mechanics of walking, which again, like that's basically an autonomic thing, right? Like after we learn how to walk as a baby, and all of this was me. So it's just remarkable to like read, and to be like it's like frustrating because I accidentally put myself here thinking I was like helping myself, which I think a lot of people are in that state. Like they think they're doing the right thing by like fasting and all of this other stuff. And we're like unknowingly putting ourselves here and then having to come out of it, I think is the difficult thing.
And speaking of fasting, one point that I wanted to touch on is they cover fasting in this chapter.
Yeah.
And something in the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned, Kathleen, that many people say, I function so much better when I'm fasting, but hey, maybe that's like a relative sensation that you're experiencing at the time, because they don't record that at all in studies of fasting. So effective fasting on speed of choice reactions. So they say the average time for 200 reactions increased from 357 to 391 after 12 hours of fasting, 423 after 24 hours of fasting. So essentially the reaction time increased when an individual went into a fasting state. So I thought that was an important thing that they brought up in that section. And then the last thing that I have for this chapter is like talking about the recovery period. So again, in the MSE, you have the control where they were eating as normal, higher normal calorie, 3,500. The starvation period, which was like 1500 to 1700 calories, and then the recovery period where they started to increase calories. So do you want to walk us through what happened there?
Yeah, so during the, let's see, I have one quote that says, during the first 12 weeks of nutritional rehabilitation, the vitamin and protein supplementations, because there were certain groups that got additional supplementations to the calories to see if that had any statistical significance. And it said did not result in statistically significant differentiations. The caloric differences were reflected with some degree of consistency only in the test of strength. So basically, if they were part of that slightly higher caloric group, their strength increases were slightly better, but not really statistically significant. So again, like based off of like what we've seen with the heart and other things, I would still like more recommend the slower approach based off of what they find here.
Yep. So they did see like recovery of normal functions to return. And they noted that the rate of recovery was inversely related to the magnitude of deterioration. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much all I had from that chapter. Kathleen, what is your main takeaway from these sections? Well, actually, do you have anything else from, I should have asked that.
Also, is Henry needing you?
In like, probably, I have like 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see here. I think that was it. Mostly they showed that like the manual work was the thing that got hit the most, and having to, basically do any kind of like lifting or more long distance, like moving, where like the more fine motor skills were not as hit. So that was like I think the big, summary from the MSc of like what was hit with the LEA. But like from the 3 sections, I don't know, like always when I read this and I go back through this, I'm just always again amazed by like how all encompassing this is and how it's literally every single system and how so many of the chronic conditions and things that, people experience nowadays are very much reflected in this, and that how it's not, it's not just endocrinology, it's not just neurology, it's not, it's everything combined. And I think that we continue to do a disservice to people by just looking at individual compartments and individual systems versus looking at the total energetic state of the being. And again, like, this isn't to say that this is the only thing, but it's like until we have addressed this, and based off of how long some of this takes to address, we're talking years, and of course do things on top of this, but like until you've kind of given this adequate time, you've done this for years. Like, I put out a challenge about 3 months ago on my Substack for people to hit the 100% of the theoretical RDAs from food over the next 3 months. And like how many people, did that, right? Like how many people are actually doing that? And until we kind of do these more foundational things, it's like it's very hard to argue that it can't be this. I think that's what it comes down to me, is that it's hard to argue that. So I think that's kind of the big takeaway that I continue to get from the MSE.
My biggest takeaway so far is similar to how we've discussed in today's chapter, where you said there's no one that understands where the water goes when you drink it.
Right.
I don't think that there's a level of understanding of how an LEA can impact an individual, because it can vary person to person. So if we were to list out all the different organ systems and function in the body on a line, all of them require a certain amount of energy. Mm-hmm. If you are in an LEA state, what gets impacted? And I don't think we understand that, right? Is it a general drop in systemic function for some people where you kind of see symptoms across the board? Does one area get hit a lot more than others? And I think that that's an important thing to remember too, is an LEA state will impact everyone differently. I didn't have like neuropathy, but I had other symptoms, right? And so understanding that, I think, is very freeing, because again, it just goes back to, like Kathleen said this in one of the earlier podcasts, a rising tide lifts all boats. Right. And so if you are able to address this energetic state of the systemic organism, all functions are going to rise. Are certain areas going to need a little bit more support than others? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But like you said, until you address that, nothing is going to get better.
Right.
You're going to just be Band-Aid approach, Band-Aid approach, Band-Aid approach, and then something else will pop up.
Right.
Yes.
Sarah, what's your take on today?
Takeaway?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of reflecting back, and like, I'm sure a lot of our audience members, like Kathleen said, is in her own situation, she's kind of beating herself up like, oh, I did this to myself and I have to come out of it. Yeah, I mean, that stinks. Like, it's really a harsh realization. Sometimes I still get frustrated with myself. Like, why did I put myself through that? But then again, just like how we're doing a disservice to people who, like when we talk about all these different diets, I think it's also a disservice that so much of our society is idolizing physiques that are promoting eating less and less and less, and especially youth growing up who are aspiring to be thin. And I know that I think it goes into anorexia and the special sections at the end of this. So I think that's going to be an interesting conversation, because a lot of people who are dealing with health issues are also dealing with a body image issue. And so you have to work through both, unfortunately, if you're going to recover.
Right.
And so hopefully we can start to talk about that soon too.
Yeah. In like what you just said too, like, that's why I very much appreciate, for example, Ash, that like you share your lifting to social media, because I think a lot of people, because of Instagram and Facebook and all that, we have very skewed ideas of what like a natty looks like, and like, what is, potentially attainable as a natty. And yes, there are some amazing natural athletes, but it's taken them years and years and years to get there. It's not just like an overnight thing. Where I think a lot of what we see is very skewed because of, well, many reasons, but primarily because of things like PEDs and now the GLP-1s and all of that stuff.
And Kathleen shared this story. Like, I think people think, oh, steroids, that's male bodybuilders. It's so prevalent in female bodybuilding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it goes beyond that too. Like, I'm watching Emily in Paris right now, and the main character, like, she's beautiful, but she's rail thin.
Yeah.
And all the supporting characters, I mean, not all of them, but just like it's based upon like Paris fashion culture and stuff. And so that is what is promoted to even people outside of the fitness world. And she's what made me think of like covering your ears in like a very loud spot. Like, that's the type of personality I get. And it's just, every time I watch it, I'm just like, wow, like if I was a young girl right now, I would be like, oh my God, I want to look, just as thin as her.
Right. Well, and like a couple years ago or older, like The Devil Wears Prada, the movie, where he's like, what is it? Like a 2 is the new 6 or something like that. And then Emily is like, I'm just one more stomach flu away from like fitting into my Paris gowns and stuff like that. Yeah. Like from the very beginning, I think women and also men too are very much like hit of like, this is the expectation of how you should look. And, I a lot of my things were driven by, I was trying to get smaller. And then I was like, well, none of these diets are working for me, so I'm going to start fasting because I cannot eat. I can do that until I couldn't anymore. And so, I understand. And again, that's why, I think there's multiple pieces of the pie. There's the biochem, there's the biophysics, there's the psycho-emotional. And I think the psycho-emotional is a big one that, people think, oh, I just got to find the next supplement, or I just got to find the next diet, or I just got to spend all day out in the sun, or, whatever. And it's like, but we also have to really address the psycho-emotional piece. And so, yeah, I think it's a great thing that you bring up.
I can't wait to talk about it. Yeah.
All right. Next chapter will be work capacity. We'll start with that, and lots of exciting. Sorry, guys, we still are talking about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, but I think it'll be something that I hope people can look back on and learn something from this long podcast discussion and all the chapters. And again, on YouTube, we have a playlist, Minnesota Starvation Experiment playlist, that you can go and watch all of them. But Kathleen, can you remind people where they can find your Substack, all of that?
Yeah, probably the easiest thing is probably just to go to my Instagram. It's at Recoen, RECOEN. And then my Substack link is there.
Okay.
You can buy her a coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah. Please don't feel like you have to. I love talking about this, and I think hopefully it is helping some people. I know, like I said, it literally saved my life because I was one more rhabdo away from having 0 kidney function, and that's basically it. So hopefully people are getting something out of this.
For sure. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you.